You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
Ever met a foundation that does it all? Say hi to NARS Light Reflecting Foundation. Makeup meets skincare in a bottle. It evens skin tone, blurs imperfections, and has a natural radiant finish. Plus, it's formulated with skincare ingredients to help strengthen your skin's barrier. With a newly expanded shade range of over 40 radiant shades to choose from and buildable all-day wear. NARS Light Reflecting Foundation. Find your perfect match.
I'd never met Daniel Arnold before this conversation, but my guess is that this guy can make anyone feel the comfort of familiarity just mere moments after a first encounter. While his experience is obviously relevant to the freelancer and of course that of a photographer, his writing background has left him with a unique ability to articulate the human experience in a way that feels pretty universal. In his absence of a plan and the art he's learned when it comes to just letting go, Daniel's giving the guy who claims to know little, which is always a sign of someone who knows a lot. Taking us through his experiences both on set and the streets, we start to see his work as a movie that's been made out of little snippets of our current reality.
This is Daniel Arnold, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
So obviously in these conversations, there's a great deal that we can research online, but the reality is there's always those tales that one never knows unless you ask directly. So tell us about those early years and what kind of through line you found in the Daniel Arnold that is today.
That's an interesting one to think about. I've said it before, but I come from a big family.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the oldest of 6 kids. And I really do think that reveals itself as meaningful in new ways all the time. You know, I realized by the time I was like 11 or 12 that there just was not going to be enough attention to go around. Like I wasn't going to be the star, the role that I was born into in the family. And so there was this sort of prompt and opening to just make my own world and entertain myself. And it also set me up to kind of never let anybody see me sweat, never like reveal any particular ambition, and kind of work behind the scenes so that, you know, whatever I came up with, whatever little flourish of identity or project could just like arrive fully formed with no evidence of struggle. When I was a kid, I always equated it with this folktale of the elves in the cobbler shop, that the cobbler would go to bed with this incredibly overwhelming pile of shoes to fix, and he'd wake up in the morning and they would just all be fixed. I think early on, I had this sort of introduction to this possibility of creating this illusion of magic. I hadn't made the connection until thinking about it for your sake that also when I was 4 years old, David Copperfield made me disappear and turned me into a duck in front of most of Milwaukee. And I think that like, although I've never been like a magic guy, I don't know, that's always been a big priority for me, is to make evidence that, you know, things could be better than the rules of the world allow.
What a beautiful sentiment. And you obviously didn't always do what you do today. You kind of started in that more traditional path and had a role in the corporate world. So let's jump to that point in your life, what it was you were doing and at what point you found the catalyst to make the jump into becoming a photographer.
It's funny. I feel like I've never had it put to me that way. I mean, I was in a very corporate place. I worked at Viacom for years, but I never thought of it as corporate. Like, I think I didn't even know what corporate was until I got to the other side of it. You know, I was working as a writer. That was kind of like my mission, my dream when I showed up here when I was 23. And the corporate route, the Viacom desk, was just like a survival adaptation. Like, I knew that I wasn't going to be writing articles about bands and paying my rent. And so I set myself up with, you know, whatever version of a stable backbone that I could.
Mm-hmm.
And that ended up being like kind of this miraculous improv where, without knowing what I was doing, the corporate thing, it just ended up being the perfect incubator where, you know, I had work that I could kind of do in my sleep. I was writing like Britney Spears bio or, you know, a SpongeBob SquarePants quiz. And I would finish that work, you know, in a minute. And then, you know, I'd sit in front of a computer all day and learn to talk to the internet, which ends up being incredibly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
but then also just like engage with all these different ways of scratching the creative itch. And, in that sort of like purposefully in that role, it was freelance writing assignments, like articles, profiles, more in-depth writing work. And in that regard, there was another intention, which was that I felt like if I went to a desk job like that, a Viacom, that being forced to just crank it out every day would somehow unblock me from the horror of the blank page. Like if I automated creativity, that it would cultivate some kind of fluency in me, which it never did, but it did give me plenty of time and stability to just like let my mind wander. And it took me all kinds of crazy places.
At what point did you first start thinking about photography as a medium and the idea that you would kind of jump ship and pursue that full time?
Yeah, it's crazy. I never thought of it as even being a job. I didn't consider it as a possibility. I didn't know what a photographer was. I was always interested in photography. From the time I was a little kid, it's just like, I've said it before, it's just an irresistible magic trick that you could turn time into a piece of paper. And I think especially in that big family mentality is like so enforced the value of these passing little kind of micro gem moments. So I was always tuned in that way, not necessarily in the language of photography, but just as like a storyteller and a hoarder and a preserver of sort of the preciousness and hilariousness of life. But I don't know. I mean, I guess in the course of doing that sort of sprawling creative work in my first 10 years in New York, I just, as you do, without even noticing, started amassing my sort of like-minded community of creative people working for magazines. I'd get paired with a photographer, and I met people. I met Jason Nacito and Tim Barber, who were doing things in this sort of very professional photographer, but artsy mind frame. I was taking pictures like from the minute I showed up in New York. I was like, I need a camera always.
Mm-hmm.
I see 15 things an hour that I want to take with me.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking pictures poorly for the most part. But yeah, it never occurred to me to pursue it as a career because I didn't know that existed. And really, as much as I am tempted to curse the word, Instagram came into the world and Instagram just kind of like blew up in my hands. What I was doing back then was kind of like I was in search of punchlines as much as I was like subway pathos. I had this giant collection, this giant backlog of weird little stuff I'd seen on the subway, or like heartbreaking exchanges or hilarious juxtapositions, whatever. I had this big pile, and I had a way to kind of activate it suddenly. And it just, through the combination of that and having that community that I mentioned, that like incidental, like who you collect as you go community, it just went all the right places right away. And I had all this momentum. And really at that point, my everyday job was write SpongeBob SquarePants quizzes, essentially.
But was there a definitive project or something that had come along that made you feel sufficiently empowered, or like you could economically live off this? Or what was that pivotal moment that led to the job?
Oh, no, there was never any proof of concept. I mean, I partnered up on a few projects with a stylist named Susan Wingett. Susan was, she was doing her own magazine. She was like based out of her apartment in the Chelsea Hotel. It was all very glamorous and like exit strategy, other planet, like terraforming Mars kind of situation. And she had a lot of faith in me and was nudging me. And, Tim Barber, I think especially, was a big voice at that moment. It's so long ago at this point, it's hard to even clock. But first I tried to get fired, which was very demoralizing. I thought I could at least collect unemployment for a while, but my boss was an old friend and it just felt so shitty to just flagrantly just flop at my job. And so I quit very abruptly, very spontaneously, and really got to my first Monday of unemployment and realized then, oh yeah, I still have to pay the bills. Like I said, big family. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. It wasn't like I had big monetary support coming in. I was like really on my own. I think in a way that repeats itself throughout the story, I just like embraced this emergency and adapted. And for one thing, had incredibly good luck. I mean, that same day where I realized that I needed to pay the bills, somebody who I didn't know but knew of posted on Facebook that they needed an assistant, a photographer. great photographer, Grant Cornett. He very graciously gave me a shot. On that first day, we shot covers for the New Yorker fiction issue. And I didn't promote myself. I didn't introduce myself even. I just hung out with the photo editor and made small talk and picked the music and made jokes and made everybody comfortable. And the next day, she found me on Facebook, of all places, and was like, "Hey, what's your story? I think I have a job for you." And, obviously New Yorker editorial, I probably made like $400, but it didn't help with my crushing brokenness. But I ate a lot of toast and I really loved what I was doing and embraced kind of desperate living for a couple of years till things stabilized. There was never a plan, and there's still never a plan. It's always been just like kind of cross your fingers and jump.
Well, we talk about the kind of fueling aspect of having a passion or something that feels purposeful in one's life. And obviously that annoys the hell out of people who don't necessarily know what their passion is. But there's also this daunting kind of fear when one contemplates stepping out of an established infrastructure that is a full-time job into the world of freelance, where sure, it might be more purposeful, more aligned with your passion. But, there's not necessarily a level of job security. And there's this one moment I remember being on set and hearing between a very prolific photographer and hairstylist. And I thought it was quite comical in real time, but it's really stuck with me since, which was that, they were saying, we don't have job security, we're freelance. And in my head, I'm thinking, you're loaded. But it is a very different world to live in, just in terms of your relationship to work. And before I jump into a question I've just been dying to ask you about that. I mean, I guess you're kind of answering it already in terms of how the transition was for you going from something full-time to this sort of, unknown world of whether or not your next paycheck was tomorrow or a month from now. Outside of the support from the people you've mentioned, how did you kind of navigate that? What sort of tricks did you learn, if any?
I don't know that I could identify any particular trick. Kind of the greatest education of the whole experience is just getting comfortable letting go. I guess that I think is easy to dismiss as very privileged. And of course, I had a lot of good luck on my side, but I think that it's more than that. It's like, if you trust yourself and you believe in what you're doing and more or less believe that things will turn out okay, especially if it's just you. I had nobody else to say, we only have toast today. It was fine for me to suffer alone for this. My own sacrifices were like, yeah, of course. Didn't even think of it. Letting go of any kind of visualized destination, any kind of idea of what was the right way to do things, and just being kind of fluid and brave in a way that didn't come naturally to me. But it sort of enforced this new counter nature where I had to survive, so I did.
I mean, it's incredibly admirable. And the question that I was desperate to ask was around your having mentioned in a previous interview these sort of periodic bouts of depression that you kind of encounter, only to then stumble upon this incredible image that you've taken and it all sort of goes away. And you realize that's all that was missing. And, something that's kind of emerging in the culture in a more commonly practiced way, or at least prescriptive way, is of course things like stoicism, right? This idea that happiness comes from within. The only thing we have control over is how it is we respond to things, but not necessarily what those things are. And I was curious as to whether or not that experience that you described, where the depression sort of comes and goes depending on the whims of your finding that next great picture, is A, something you still face, and B, does it fuel you, or is it a struggle that you look to sort of surmount one day?
Well, I think it's worse than ever. I mean, I think it's probably a thing that does get harder and harder to combat, because it was much easier to get that next picture when I hadn't taken that many pictures.
Mm-hmm.
Now I'm like, hundreds of thousands deep to get something where I can impress myself, where I can forget impress, when I can satisfy myself, is much rarer. I don't know. It's like this mystery alchemy. Like, I don't even know how to do it. I give a disclaimer at the start of most jobs, where I pull a model aside if I'm lucky enough to have a model and say, like, look, I got to tell you, I don't know how to do anything good on purpose. Like, we just got to find our way through here and hopefully have fun. And I know that we'll get something, but like, I don't have instructions for you. We just got to have an experience here. And yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing problem. It's a right now problem. right now, I think I'm a shit photographer. It's very hard to prove myself otherwise. But, I also relate to, in a way, to that stoicism angle.
Mm-hmm.
I think more than happiness comes from within. I just completely deprioritized happiness. But there's something about the long game. Anybody who had the misfortune of stopping me on the street this week got to hear about how I fell down a rabbit hole of work from 2017 this week and realized that I hadn't tagged any of it. So, it doesn't show up in searches and it's been kind of invisible to me. And it was this great discovery that in the face of, turning out roll after roll of kind of mediocre, same old thing, like, what am I doing? What kind of mistake can I make next to get something that's actually interesting to me? I also have the option, newly, being like 10 plus years into this, where the old work can now be the new work. I can keep grinding and making this work now I can write off as like, this is for future me to figure out. I can't even tell if it's good now. I don't know what I'm doing now. And have this sort of like circular thing where I'm not reliant on breakthroughs of genius. It's more like an engagement with the whole body. And I've said before, like thinking about the story from the end instead of from today. There's this container to fill, and I don't want to let anything dishearten or dissuade or make me insecure enough that I don't do my best to fill that with proof of what was going on in my head.
Well, you've actually mentioned you're having resisted the idea of like having a fixed body of work. And it might seem a little bit early in the conversation to sort of go to the end and look back. But if you kind of have likened it to a rambling diary, what do you hope people will take away from the diary of photos that is the collective body of work at one point? Or is that still TBD?
I don't know. I go back and forth with worrying that it's some kind of cop-out and I should be declaring something, but I think it would be foolish to imagine that I could tell you from here what, a life of work will reveal. I think the nugget of that stays in my head that's useful to me now is just sort of the abstract concept that, what's mine in this super saturated world of people who many are doing the exact same thing that I'm doing. What's mine? And I find more and more confidently that what's mine is not something that I can access intentionally. The only thing I know is that I have to do the work, and that hopefully, if the work is what I think it is, it reveals something about me and eventually, I think, about the culture around me.
I think as an outside observer, something that is the hallmark of your work is this sort of blink and you'll miss it moment. There's a quality of presence there. And while you've just essentially explained that there's no formula that you can apply to get to where it is that you hopefully, will end up with each time you go out with your camera, how would you describe that process? Is it just a question of how present you are? You're obviously capturing things that I think a lot of people are too busy to notice down the street. So I would assume presence has something to do with it.
We're obviously very well trained, conditioned watchers where we are put in audience mode constantly. I think that everybody has that kind of equipment to tune into those frequencies. I think it's just, I don't know, maybe a matter of like looking to your life for a source of entertainment rather than for something to validate you. Instead of looking for kind of payback, to just kind of let go and enjoy the show. We're all very well trained to be entertained. So everything is now. It's all like a big culture of distracting entertainment. And I think it's a very simple matter of just like tuning in to a different frequency. I don't know.
I think that was beautifully said. It all kind of also points to the evolving relationship one has to Instagram, right? In your experience, it was an incredibly positive platform as far as the returns you got from using it.
Yeah.
Obviously, at this point, it's been around long enough for us to be well aware of the kind of negative impact it can also have on people. But how has your relationship with the performative nature of something like social media evolved from beginning to present day, where the work doesn't necessarily require it?
Well, I don't know. I think in a lot of ways, I've just been demoted from like drug dealer to addict. there was sort of a performance that I had stumbled into for a long time. It's actually really interesting what it has become. I wouldn't have been able to think of this. I didn't know such a thing was possible, but Instagram has just become like the perfect hiding place. It's like this great smokescreen where Arnold Daniel goes out and like represents the brand. I feel like the sort of public story of me is supported by this avatar, and it just leaves all of this space for me. Like I don't even really have to participate that much in the story of Arnold Daniel. I'll post assigned work once in a while or like pop in and say something stupid, but I barely participate in it. And it just leaves this great pocket for me to exist in where I can be immune to the back patting and celebrating and, the myth of my great eye or whatever, and stay in the sort of raw or more true, this kind of insecure, feral existence of still like really walking in circles, looking for God knows what every day and indulging in this sort of beginner version of my life while this avatar does the kind of down the road posturing. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And there's just so much universality to what it is you're saying that I'm so glad we're having this conversation because I think a lot of people will benefit from hearing it. But like everything you're describing feels as though it's possible within the context of what you're doing on the street, right? But when you apply that to a commission project, that doesn't seem like a luxury you have because to your point, you are showing up in a very controlled environment with a particular outcome that one has to achieve. So how do you kind of navigate whatever insecurity might arise or the organic process you're trying to unearth in those controlled and very specifically commissioned projects?
I really don't go into a commission job any better prepared than I do walking out my front door. Obviously there are variables that are controlled by other people.
Mm-hmm.
But all that really does is give me a bit more of a safety net for whatever sloppy, chaotic improv. What happens on a job? It's a very interesting kind of parallel experience where on the street, I've either walked whatever route I'm on so many times, or I'm so exhausted by the end of the day, I can use this automatic part of my brain. For better or worse, I walk around and without thinking, there's a picture, let me frame it up, got to make sure everything's in there. It's this very instinctive, like if I get it, I get it. If I don't, I don't. Don't look, just point, just, catch the world as it is. On a job, I think all the same brain chemistry comes into play from a different angle where the emergency of the task, the emergency of the like invested audience who's standing behind me as I do my job, pointing things out and making suggestions and worrying that I'm doing it wrong. I think balancing all of those expectations and also playing host, where like I'm sort of the ringleader of this big circus and I have to keep everybody's eyes on me and do my little dance and make everybody feel like they're being heard, make everybody feel involved, that they're getting to do their job too. And in the midst of all of that distraction and chaos management, isn't really room, again, for better or worse, for my intellectual brain to be like, okay, here's the picture. Here's exactly how I want it. Let's make sure I get it right. Plus, I'm shooting on film, so there's no proof that I'm getting anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the sort of cumulative, I keep saying it, but the cumulative emergency of that situation shuts off any kind of intentional thinking. And I get to work, just with my instincts, just with this, like, to me, treasured lizard brain, the kind of thing where I don't even really remember what happened until I get the pictures back a couple of days later.
Flow states.
Yeah. Flow states reinforced by enough experience. And again, like I said in the very beginning, this ongoing education of letting go.
Mm-hmm.
Just trusting that, first of all, it's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm.
And especially, when I've got a bunch of people tending to the clothes and there are other eyes on it. There are other brains that are kind of checking off other variables for me. And I can just trust my automatic brain, that I spend all of my free time practicing with.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's kind of crazy, all encompassing, hard to recommend way of doing things that I didn't set out to do. But it ends up being this kind of great confluence of all these naturally existing things that make those jobs, for me, like on the highest level. I can still walk into the scariest job and I'm scared, but I know I've been scared enough times that if I just trust the process and believe that, I'm here because somebody thinks I know what I'm doing. And I love to come out of something like that with a picture that I care about.
Mm-hmm.
So I have access, I have opportunity to come back to my big pile of pictures with something that I never could have gotten in the real world, but that still feels of that language because I didn't craft it. I just shape-shifted in an emergency and made the best of it and surprised myself. I guess I look at those situations as a great privilege that I lightly disrespect by just trusting that if I show up and let it happen, that it'll be okay.
Well, a lot of people have always said that a good image is found rather than made, which is kind of what you're describing essentially. You've also just mentioned film, and something else that I thought was really interesting that you've compared in the past in terms of digital photography being a conversation with success, whereas film is a conversation with failure. What did you even mean by that?
Well, I guess, using a digital camera, you have instant results. And so the result is part of the conversation in your head. It's part of the creative process. Every time you take a picture, you go to the screen, you leave the world and see what you've done. If you can think globally enough, know how to fix it, know how to make it better. And by removing that option, all you have is what's in front of you. And to some degree, you accept and live with the possibility of failure every time you press the button. And I don't know, there's this classic creative roadblock that you just have to break through to even start, to even begin the day. You have to accept, I'm not going to craft some vision in my head and execute it perfectly and know exactly what I'm getting back. I don't know, maybe there's a version of that, but I'm not that kind of photographer. For me, it's by accepting the possibility that even with the highest stakes that it's not going to work out. I'm not going to get a picture that I set out to get. And if I do get a picture that I set out to get, I usually don't like it. And so I think, I don't know, there's just this great lucky thing that happens when you embrace the possibility of failure, where you don't operate in a way where you're trying to avoid failure.
Mm-hmm.
It takes all the preciousness out of the conversation, and you have to be super present. You have to just let go of the results. And this is corny, but I always think about, there's a line in a Rolling Stones song. I don't even know exactly the line, paraphrase, but it's your love is like our music. It's there and then it's gone. And there's something about the musical performance that feels analogous to me here, where even if you record live music, you can't communicate the experience in the room, only in the moment, only in its presence. Obviously a photograph doesn't necessarily carry the full smell out of a situation either, but it's an interesting way to memorialize these sort of combinations of things that will never happen again. I try to catch things, take the picture before anybody knows it's being taken. And I think in that regard, where you're capturing sort of life uninterrupted, at risk of delving alienatingly deeply into the mundane and taking a picture that nobody cares about, I think you get these glimpses more of the universal than of the individual experience.
Interesting. Elaborate.
The way you could see a line of ants carrying a crumb to the hill, and you can suddenly relate to the insects. We're just bigger version of that. I mean, there are answers. I do see despair. I do see pleasure. I do see the sort of cumulative corrosion of living in a city like this. But more than that, I think you just get these kind of cultural echoes of who we are, of how we move through the world, of what's important to us. And I think that high on that list, maybe more now than ever, is distraction.
Mm.
People are on top of being incredibly preoccupied and I think worried that, you're so caught up in, if not your headphones or your phone, like just the noise of your life and the rat maze of your surroundings and all the people not to bump into, sort of in the same way that I think about going to work, this sort of autopilot that is essential to moving through the city with all your stuff to juggle, where you get a look at people in a state where they've never even seen themselves, because it's like this sort of dissociative, God forbid I say liminal, this in-between state where they spend probably most of their lives. And, I don't know if that's more or less revealing than deeply engaging with somebody. It's a different part of their kind of repertoire.
A lot of what makes your work so appealing to me personally at this particular moment in time is that it does capture all of those elements of reality that have ironically, or maybe not so ironically, but somehow become even more interesting than the kind of prescriptive dream weaving of the general imagery we see in other industries like fashion. And don't get me wrong, it's kind of the space I've spent the majority of my professional life in. I love it, no shade.
Yeah.
I just think that sometimes normal people become the new stars in a way when you can capture them in the ways you often do. And those stories bear so much more weight in a time that kind of is ironically more connected than ever. And somehow so many feel disconnected as a result. So to see each other in such real ways, such as can be found in your imagery, I think is just such a refreshing and timely body of work. And that leaves us with our last and final question. And I feel like you're perfectly positioned to answer it, which is, of course, what is contemporary now?
Yeah, well, that one's been knocking around in my head, obviously, anticipating coming to see you. And I think what's contemporary, fascism, AI, I think that, for the sake of our conversation, it's more like, what's the response to contemporary? Like, how do we navigate contemporary? Although I'm a broken record, emergency is contemporary. And, having the sort of language and preparation and faith to improvise in the face of that. I think in a world that is more and more thirsty for control and for perfection, that imperfection becomes so gorgeous and human, and spontaneity and improvisation and that sort of automatic brain that makes us human. You can't beat that by feeding prompts into a supercomputer, because you can't have the idea on purpose. That's what I love about, like, no shade to fashion for me either. But like, for me, the rules and the context of fashion are it's so juicy because there's so much to disrespect. There's so much to break.
Mm.
And I feel like that's the world we're dealing with right now, where the perfect pop song or the most unimaginable AI photograph, it's boring. You want the rust and the damage of human experience. So yeah, I think embracing the emergency and letting go and seeing what happens.
I love it. I love it all. This was awesome. Thank you so much for making the time. It was fantastic to have you on the show.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Really nice to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grinblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topmiller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week. And if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.